Today, I'll be discussing the study, How Do People Understand Race and Ethnicity? So there's little research that really exists about how the public understands the concepts of race and ethnicity. Previous research suggests that there's really this lack of validity with how race and ethnicity are operationalized within research due to this confound and misunderstanding of the concepts. In a social context, society does lack a shared definition of race, due again to this misconception and confound about race and ethnicity. So what are these concepts? Well, previous literature suggests that, or defines race as a social construct that is a fixed imposed status based on physical characteristics. It's not biologically inherited, but it really distinguishes and creates this hierarchy of power and privilege between dominant and non-dominant groups, and it's really historically and institutionally reinforced, as opposed to ethnicity, which is this fluid, dynamic concept, where it's this based on similar ancestral and geographical descent, where individuals can choose this label as opposed to the imposition of race. And it's this interaction of cultural systems based on this collective community, where you can really develop this secure sense of self and sense of belonging, again, as opposed to race. So what's the purpose of differentiating between race and ethnicity? Well, although research really differentiates between race and ethnicity, it's not differentiated colloquially. Colloquial confound may result in how participants really understand and perceive these questions about race and ethnicity and how they really report such information and how they identify with it. So that brings us back to our research question, how do people understand race and ethnicity? Well, the methodology for this study was taken from the consensual qualitative research modified method, which really allowed us to capture themes and categories inductively, unlike a quantitative measure. It allowed for a larger sample size because it had open-ended questions that had limited responses. So we could really capture what these participants were trying to say, but it was limited enough that we could have a large data sample size for analysis. It adopts post-positivistic and constructivistic philosophies of science because it has this general understanding that there is a general understanding of race and ethnicity, and it sets out to find out what that is. It's constructivistic because there's this bottom-up process of analysis where instead of having a hypothesis and trying to prove whether it's correct or incorrect, we're taking the data and trying to pull out these emerging themes bottom-up and allowing the data to kind of speak for itself. And it also requires reflexivity of the analyzers because we have to take a step back and understand how we perceive race and ethnicity for ourselves and what we may be bringing into this study. So the participants, there are 151 participants, 53 males, 87 females, and 11 people who chose not to identify their gender. It required that they were 18 years of age, and the age range was from about 18 to 64, median age of about 28, 29 years old. The education range was they had completed grades 7 to 11 all the way up to receiving a graduate degree. About half of the sample had completed high school or was in college. As you can see here, I have the self-identified race and self-identified ethnicity of the sample. It is primarily racially white and primarily ethnically European American, but there is some diversity within the sample. So the process for the procedure. It is an online survey that takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. Participants were compensated about $5 of course credit if they were in college, and were entered to win a $300 Amazon gift card. They were asked a series of questions about race and ethnicity, how it affected them, what it means to them, and how they identify, but this study particularly focuses on how do participants understand race and ethnicity as separate questions. There's a controlled order of questions, so half the participants received the race question first, the other half received the ethnicity question first. And then the survey was completed with a demographic survey. So for data analysis, we first reviewed all of the data, the 151 responses individually. We took 30 to 50 responses, half who received the race question first, the other half who received the ethnicity question first to account for any order effects. And then we really came together as a group and tried to develop this initial list of codes by discussing what themes were coming out of these data samples. So we began recoding the initial 30 to 50 responses with an additional 20 to 40 responses, and began this process of revising, expanding, and discussing all these themes that were emerging from the data, We then were able to create and organize a code book. From that point, we coded everything into the computer program in vivo, providing rationale for why we were coding certain responses with certain themes. Then we had this non-consensus coding discussion where if we didn't agree with how a certain theme was defined or whether it was capturing certain responses, we would continue talking about it until we had this group consensus of what it was trying to capture, really attempting to capture exactly what these participants were trying to say. This continued in a process of adding, removing, and refining different themes. We had outliers and rationale, meaning that the outliers were most of the research team thought that something should be coded under a certain theme, and the outlier was saying, I don't know, I really don't think this is what it's trying to capture. So we had these discussions where either the outlier would then agree with the team provided with rationale, or the team would agree with the outlier, or we would continue adding, revising, and expanding codes until we came to consensus. Final consensus was reached through an item-by-item process, meaning we went through the 151 responses individually and picking apart which ones we did not agree on until we had final full consensus. Further distinctions have been made. The data I will present today will be the initial data analysis for the race coding. The ethnicity is complete, but we are revisiting it just to make sure that we differentiate between any codes that seem similar or different between the two and really integrating the data together. And also just a note, it did take about 6 to 9 months each for the race and ethnicity data analysis. So we really worked through this iterative collaborative analysis. We had 2 coding teams, one for race, one for ethnicity, that consisted of a professor, graduate students, and undergraduate students, 5 coders on each team. And it was this iterative collaborative analysis because we were repeatedly going through this data over and over and over again until we came up with these themes. Once we came up with the themes, we were over and over and over again looking to make sure that they were really capturing what these participants were trying to say. This really minimized groupthink, any bias potential we could have, and created a system of checks and balances for the coders so that we couldn't really bring in any biases. So that brings us to, from this whole data analysis, we came up with 3 domains: content, process, and function. Content meaning participants were defining the general definition of race or ethnicity. But then we came to realize not everyone was describing exactly these general definitions. People had some emotional responses or talked about the purpose of race or ethnicity. So we came up with these process and function codes. Process defining how do participants talk about the meaning. They will define race or ethnicity by doing some mental process through their response. Function meaning what is the purpose of race or ethnicity, what is its effect, what is its function within society. So this is just an example from the race data. It's defining race as, it means culture and diversity, except everyone bickers about it and can't get over whichever stereotype it pertains to. People are ignorant when it comes to race, and they need to submerge themselves in environments or communities with an extensive plethora of races. Smart Aleck responds to the question, how many races are there in the world? While people begin to count the types of skin colors or ethnicity, someone shouts, 1, the human race. It would be nice for a world to think like that without stereotypes or categorizing and embracing diversity. So in this example, you can really see they do define race as culture and diversity, but there's this richness and all this additional content. What do we do with it? Instead of really losing the voice of the participant, we wanted to capture it, so we came up with these process and function themes. So I'm going to talk about the content, process, and function themes across race and ethnicity, and talk about the most frequent ones that came up through the data. So these are the content themes that we came up with for ethnicity, answering the question, what is the general definition of ethnicity? All responses received a content theme, but I'm just going to discuss the most frequent. The most frequent for ethnicity content theme was origin and background, with 45.03% frequency. This is when participants would define ethnicity as having some sort of origin and background, and we split this into different sub-themes depending on what they were talking about. For example, some participants talked about a geographical country or location. For example, ethnicity is one's geographic heritage, what region of the world you are from, and related cultural traditions. Other participants talked about this sovereignty or nationality, where they would say ethnicity is nationality or religious affiliation. Lastly, other participants talked about this general origin and background that was really unspecified, talking about where I am from. For example, ethnicity is one's own origin. The second most frequent ethnicity theme was when participants would relate ethnicity to culture, having some cultural influence or cultural norm. For example, ethnicity is a subgroup of humans sharing the same or similar culture. The third most frequent ethnicity content theme was ancestry. It really talked about how ethnicity related to having this shared historical knowledge that was passed down between family, ancestry, lineage, some sort of heritage or descent. For example, ethnicity to me is my background, the heritage I inherited from my family and where our ancestors came from. And then lastly, the fourth most frequent ethnicity theme was related to race, where participants in some form related ethnicity to race. We split this into 4 different sub-themes. Some participants described ethnicity as being broader than race. For example, when I think of ethnicity, I not only think of someone's racial background, but their religious background and their ancestry. Some participants said they're exactly the same as race, just in a nicer way. Some participants said that they were similar, they had some sort of overlap, but there was some differentiation between the two. Ethnicity is similar to race. A person's ethnicity is dependent on their country of origin or the country their family is originally from. And lastly, some participants talked about ethnicity being this concept entirely within the concept of race, so we named this subdistinction of race. At first I said that race means group I belong to. Ethnicity is when you subdivide this group into many cells. So that brings us to our race content themes. Again, this really defined the question, what is race? What is the general definitions? All responses received some sort of content theme, but you can really notice it's a lot more complex than the ethnicity themes. A small percentage of participants did not answer with a general definition. They were given a no content theme. Other participants used someone else's meaning, for example, a scientist's meaning, and they were labeled someone else's meaning. But because the study really focuses on how the public understands it, I'm going to talk about the participants' own meanings and the most frequent for race. So the most frequent race content theme was physical characteristics. Participants defined race as having physical characteristics or appearance. For example, a race is a subgroup of humans identifiable by physical characteristics, mainly skin color. The second most frequent race content theme related to culture and ethnicity, having either, again, this was split between 2 sub-themes, talking about culture and some socio-religious aspect. It means the features of the body and color of skin and ways of living tied to cultural traditions. Or some participants just related it to ethnicity. To me, race means your ethnicity. The third most frequent race content theme was origin and background. You notice this was similar with ethnicity. Again, we had to split this into sub-themes depending on what the participants were trying to say. They either said specifically it relates to place, nationality, or geography. To me, race means different nationalities and culture. Or again, relating it to some unspecified background or origin, saying where I am from. It's a definition of someone's or their family's origin. Lastly, the fourth most frequent race content theme was when participants would relate it to having a social group where they have these shared experiences or commonalities. For example, race means a society of people identified by their ancestors, culture, etc. So that brings us to our ethnicity process themes. Again, this answers the question, participants will define ethnicity by doing one of these process themes. This was less frequent than the content theme, so I'm only going to talk about the 2 most frequent, but all responses received some sort of process theme, whether it was a straightforward definition or one of these process themes. So the most frequent was when participants approached defining ethnicity by describing or listing different aspects of ethnicity. We call this multifaceted. Ethnicity is a combination of geography, culture, language, and religion. The second most frequent ethnicity process theme was when participants compared ethnicity or defined what it wasn't, negatively defined it. For example, ethnicity to me is a broader grouping of people that is not based on race, but more so on common cultural beliefs and traits. My ethnicity is a huge part of who I am. And that brings us to our race process themes. Again, answering the question, they're approaching defining race by doing one of these process themes. Again, less frequent than the content themes, but the race process themes were more frequent than the ethnicity process themes. So the most frequent were when participants would approach defining race by focusing on its function or effect within society. For example, race is made up of social construction, which divides the human species and is often abused by certain groups to oppress others. The second most frequent example was when participants would approach defining race by objecting to